Hello, everyone. Um, as Sean mentioned, my name's Brian Green. I'm a landscape architect in New York. I'm the director at Terrain NYC Landscape Architecture. We primarily practice in New York, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. It's a real honor to speak to you all. Let me just do a brief intro, and then we can jump into it. Um, sorry. So Terrain was founded in 2004 by Stephen Tupu, who's a fellow Kiwi, as Sean is. We're based in New York, projects worldwide, and I think over the years we've focused mostly on delivering equitable landscapes using ecology as an agent for transformation. And we can talk about that more. Just a quick about me. I am the director, and I started here in 2015 as a junior designer. So I've worked my way up, and I finished my MLA at Virginia Tech at the WAC, as Sean mentioned, in December of 2014. So I'm going to uh, talk a little bit, more about my background. And as I do that, I'll flip through some project images. If you have any questions about any of them at the end, just ask and we can go back to them. So just keep that in mind. So as I'm meeting with students and young people and, interviewing, one question I always like to ask is, how did you find landscape architecture? And so I'll ask myself that question to kick us off. And for me, I did not study landscape architecture as an undergrad. I didn't even know it was a thing until I was probably 25 years old. So I'm always very impressed by folks who found it at a young age and have the commitment and the maturity to practice as undergrads, because I know I certainly didn't at that time. Um, so how I found the profession, my undergrad was in interdisciplinary studies, which is essentially um, learning how to read, write, make a coherent logical argument. I focused on communications, law, economics, and government. So about the as far away from a creative study as you can get. Um, and after school, I got a job as a paralegal at a law firm. I worked there for about 2.5 years, and actually at one point I took the LSAT and applied to law school, and I was all ready to start at a law school. And I just asked myself, like, I work at this firm, there's all these incredibly intelligent, smart, successful, well-paid people. They're some of the best in their industry, and they seem really miserable. And I was like, if I'm gonna devote myself to this, I don't want to still be miserable at the end of it. And so I kind of knew that the law wasn't for me. And that was really tough because, you're early 20s and you're trying to figure out what is for you. And so I took classes at George Washington University, which was nearby, and a really wide range of fields like biology, um, some drawing classes, and eventually I did find landscape design, although there it was more about residential design. And I eventually quit at the law firm and took on a whole lot of odd jobs to pay my rent, including working for a landscape design build firm in Northern Virginia. And I'll never forget, we were working in this incredible home. And, I was just like shoveling gravel, just doing manual labor. And it hit me like the only people that will ever experience this place are, the owner, their family and friends, but it's completely walled off. And, that was a kind of like aha moment where like, okay, I know I'm interested in this, but like, how do I do it on a public scale? And so then that's when I figured out what landscape architecture was. I quit the program at George Washington and eventually found the WAC. Um, I also want to talk a little bit early on about, the sort of end of my studies at Virginia Tech and that transition from student to, uh, professional. And, I think it's important to have goals and objectives as you're, beginning to venture out into the professional world. And, even my time at the law firm, while, you know, it wasn't necessarily rewarding in some of the ways I thought it would be, I learned a lot, and I learned the value of, communication, professionalism, meeting deadlines, and all those things. And but what I also learned is that, folks were working incredible hours, drafting documents, and those documents might save our clients millions of dollars easily, tens of millions of dollars, depending on what we were working on. And then that document that we would have worked on for, 6 months or more would literally go into a folder, and it would never be read again, ever. And I mean that, like, no one would ever read this piece of paper again. And I realized then that if I was going to dedicate that kind of time and energy, it needed to be towards something that, would have legacy, that potentially could impact other people, that potentially could outlive myself. And it wasn't enough to just produce a document. And so that was an early discovery, I think you could call it. And I carried that with me as I started to look for jobs after school. I was really interested in building landscapes. I wanted to be at a firm that was doing a lot of work, not necessarily the largest jobs, but maybe, quantity over size in some ways. So that was one important objective I brought with me. And of course, you can never know where these things are gonna go. I didn't. I took a little bit of time off after school. I was pretty burned out, and eventually realized I needed to get a job. And um, I found out through a friend that there was a 3-month sublet available in a place called Astoria, Queens, which I had never heard of, and I took it. So I knew I had 3 months to find a job, and I put all my belongings into storage in Virginia and drove up to New York. And so the first, say, half of that 3 months, I only spent on reworking my portfolio, because I realized that I would only get one shot to make an impression at these firms. And, I had 3 months. So I wanted to make sure that, what I sent out was the absolute best work that I could produce. So I redrew, drawings from studio that I hadn't opened in, years, and, redid renderings, relaid out the whole portfolio, all of that. And eventually I spent sort of my last few dollars, had it all printed, hard copy, and I sent 20 copies out to firms all over New York in the snail mail. And then I just kind of sat back and hoped something would happen. I do think in general, it's much harder to, delete. It's much harder to throw away a physical resume and portfolio than to, just delete or ignore something that comes into your inbox. And I was interested in firms that would respond to something that was physical. So, long story short, met Steven, and that was 9.5 years ago. And I've been at Terrain ever since. So that's a bit of a long introduction, but I hope you had a chance to look at some of the work that I've been involved with at Terrain. We'll jump out and scale a little bit. So we do work all over the world. You can see these little T symbols represent projects, but we do mostly focus in New York. So here's a map of the city. Sure, some of you know it, but the 5 boroughs: Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Manhattan. This is Jersey. Yonkers is just north of the city. And then this is Long Island. So what I've started to do here is map some of the recent very large landscape infrastructure projects over maybe the last 5 to 10 years. This is not a comprehensive list, but I think it is most of them. So, you're probably familiar with some of these projects like Little Island, the extension of the High Line. There's been all kinds of waterfront work in, Brooklyn and Queens, Domino Park, the sort of completion of Brooklyn Bridge Park. And then there's some other things you may not be familiar with. You may be like, the Bronx River Greenway, Shirley Chisholm State Park, which is built on top of a landfill. It's a really interesting park. Fresh Kills in Staten Island. So we'll come back to this. And this is Terrain's projects, not all of them, but many of them. And so you see the purple is completed work, pink is in construction, and gray is in design. You'll see some clusters in certain neighborhoods, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But, typically most of the work is in the Bronx, Manhattan, and sort of throughout Brooklyn, especially Eastern Brooklyn, which is also known as East New York. If we break this down a little further, this is just completed work, not things that are in design or in construction, but we look at the typology, the types of work, the types of project that we're doing at Terrain. Green is public, commercial, academic. Yellow is single family residential. So think like, a rear yard of a home or a private terrace on the roof. The orange is market rate. So this is multifamily. So this is like an apartment building or townhomes, things like that, multiple units. And people are living there, either they're buying condos or they're paying rent at the market rate of that neighborhood. And then in blue, which is, probably more than half, is affordable and supportive multifamily housing. So this is also apartment buildings, things of that nature, but the people living there aren't paying necessarily the median for that neighborhood. And so what you may not be familiar with affordable and supportive housing. I know I wasn't in school, but what this means a lot of things. This is a big umbrella. So these are just a few examples, but typically how these projects are structured is that there's a developer and then there's a community partner. And the community partner pairs up with the developer and they get space in the building and they offer some type of service. And that service might be for the residents of the building. It might be for the neighborhood. It might be for some combination of both. So, just for example, the community partner could be an urban farm and people are coming there and growing food. It could be a dance school, or an art gallery, but it could also be things that are more targeted for the folks that live in the building. So often that's, mental and physical health clinics, supporting people with HIV/AIDS, other types of disabilities, survivors of domestic violence. We also do, a lot of housing for formerly homeless, both youth and seniors, veterans, and then there's all types of transitional housing that people are only intended to be in for a certain period of time. And when we overlay these affordable and supportive housing projects with the sort of large scale landscape infrastructure projects in the city, we start to see something, right? So you can see that many of these blue dots are very far away from the green dots. Look at the Bronx up here, or, East New York. This is a lot of housing and there's very little investment in landscape. And so I think as a landscape architect, it's just, and since COVID, we know that having access to quality landscape outdoor space is, critical for our well-being and our health. And so we really, really at Terrain, we really work hard to give folks that live in these buildings absolute best, outdoor space that we possibly can with the resources at hand. We don't really treat these projects any differently than we would, a single family estate out in the Hamptons. The design process is the same, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And I think it's just it's just so important to keep in mind that, I think even in your academic work that like when you visit a site to think about like what's nearby, those relationships to sort of the broader picture, the neighborhood, what is the tree canopy like? And then let that inform your design. So I wanted to share some images of some of these different types of affordable and supportive housing, just to you can get a sense of what some of these projects look like. So this is Bay Arthur Residence, which is transitional housing for formerly homeless LBGT youth in Manhattan. Small building, small rear yard. This is a shelter for homeless families. So a lot of kids, you can actually see if you look closely, a lot of chalk. Kids love writing on chalk all over this site, which is really fun. This is supportive housing for people living with mental illness in the Bronx. And, we really made a big effort, and Stephen especially, at the onset of the project, to keep the stone in place, keep the bedrock in place, push the building away from the street edge, from the street wall, and then actually, give people an opportunity to come out over the top of the rock. This has been, I think, a very successful project, but affordable and supportive housing. This is Baychester Houses. So this is actually owned by the city. This is NYCHA. This is public housing. And we were part of a team that was able to renovate this. And it's been really rewarding to come back to the site and talk with, especially the kids that are, there's many playgrounds here. It's a big place, and they seem to really enjoy it. This is Simba Simbi. So this is for seniors. So a kind of different experience, right? There's some gardening in the back here, and everything is designed for accessibility. All of these are all this is all custom benches and furniture that we designed, but it's all raised up a little bit higher than a typical seat. It helps for seniors to sit down and get in and out of those benches, things like that. This is Clark Place, and something that we call swings for seniors. So we've been trying to introduce like porch swings in some of our senior buildings. It's pretty fun, and I think it's a little bit of a different scale than a lot of our work, and it's a bit of an intimate moment, and I'm hopeful that we'll have many more of these pictures coming up. And I think this is the last one I'm going to show you, although there are many more. This is called the Cordon. This is housing for survivors of domestic violence, which is obviously a very tough subject. And, we're giving clear guidance from the supportive partner on the team that like the families that live here, they may not feel safe in the neighborhood, and that this rear yard really needs to act as their backyard. This is their safe space for them and their children. And so it's sort of taking that to heart, having some playable ground, not necessarily a playground, but playable ground, and sort of some interesting seating arrangements. So I wanted to come back. I wanted to come back to this map, which you've already seen, and talk a little bit more about process. So that was something that Sean mentioned to me, and getting back also to some of my objectives when I started at Terrain, which was to build, to build as, I don't want to say as many projects as I can, but maybe as many quality projects as I could be a part of. And I actually think that this is unique to landscape architecture, because often our scope is such that we can take on many projects at once, whereas maybe an architect or an engineer, they're only working on one or two projects. They may work on that project for many years, and that's kind of all they're working on. For us, we're able to work on many projects at once, and that's a real opportunity, because it's a testing ground, right? Like each one of these dots represent something we've learned. It's something we've tried, something that we might not try again, or something we know we could do better. I think the swings for seniors is a good example of that. Like, okay, that was a test case. Now, how can we apply it at other places? What do the people that live in the building think about it? Asking them those questions. And so part of our process is simply through building, right? Through repetition. Um, we're a small office. We have 10 to 12 people, but we have a lot of projects going on, and I think it's a asset, really, even if they're not necessarily the largest projects that you read or see. So, thinking about process, I thought it would be interesting to look back at some of my drawings from when I was in school doing my MLA, and think about, like, how did they influence some of the early built work, some of the early design work I did at Terrain, because I think that's a kind of ripe avenue. And I think as you're all working on your studio projects or your academic work, like, it's really valuable. All that time, all that energy and effort that you spend exploring and studying, it's not for nothing. And I think you may find that there's certain questions you ask yourself or threads that you can try to resolve in the professional practice. Um, I'll go through some of these, but I think you'll see early that I was very interested in um, how different materials changed with elements, either sun or shade, or uh, water, things that are wet versus dry, how things wore out over time, or how their story was told over time. My thesis site was actually a quarry, which is a very exciting, and getting to see them actually do the mining. It was in Lorton, Virginia, which is in Northern Virginia. And the quarry was very happy to have us all come out and see their operations. But I think what is interesting to me is that in something like 80 years, this quarry will be filled with water and it will become a reservoir. And I think that there's a real opportunity there for landscape architects to play. Um, you know, just a few more things that I was really interested in was this study of introducing incredibly sort of flat structure or landscape to topography, so that things read, or really interested in water and reflection, and creating temporal pools. So, like, some of these pools could be filled with water sometimes, and then the next day if you came to this site it would look completely different. So it was fun to dig up some of these old renderings from school. And and then when I look at some of the early design work that I was a part of at Terrain, like, it's obvious that I was still thinking about these same things, like stone. Like, okay, how can we have many finishes on a single piece of stone? How can the landscape look completely different when it's dry versus when it's wet, or when it's sunny versus when it's shady? And I mean, even some of the geometries, I think, were born from some of those um, studies during studio and during thesis. So this is the 100 Van Dam. This is a condo terrace on the 19th floor of a building. But, this is one of the early things I worked on. And, I look back at it now and I can clearly draw those lines from what I was studying. And it was really rewarding to sort of realize some of this work. And I think as you're all studying, and I just really encourage you to just, like, whatever you're interested in, focus, and just keep asking questions, keep exploring, and it may take you places you didn't expect it to. um just thinking about applying different textures to stone, and then what happens when they get wet. Like, I think I'm still somewhat interested in this, although maybe not as much as I was 10 years ago. This is another project that kind of the first project that I was the project manager and sort of led the design effort. It is certainly a collaboration between everyone in the office, but this is one Hudson Yards. I'm sure you recognize the High Line. So it's this kind of skinny plaza and park underneath it. It was really incredible to have this as one of the first sites I was able to design anything. And again, just this real focus of contrast of different types of stone and different finishes on the stone. Um, if you change the finish of the stone, it can look very different. This is actually only two types of stone, I believe, with different types of finish. And really thinking about how those pieces come together and applying textures, things like that. So I want to talk a little bit more about terrain and our process as a firm. I'm not sure sort of your day to day, but since COVID times, we've introduced a hybrid schedule, and we treat it as, people can make their own decision for the most part if they need to be in the office or they can work from home. Obviously, there's times that when we need to get together and collaborate, and there's other times when it's better for everyone if you're on the calls all day, that you're just doing it from home. And but one thing we have introduced is every 2 weeks we get everyone together as a firm. We carve out about 3 hours out of our day and we meet and we draw and we pin up what we draw like it's studio, and we have to defend it, and we get critiques, and we also teach each other. We basically have small classes and training sessions that we do. Sometimes we bring in other people to teach us. And this has been incredibly productive. I mean, you know, if you're trying to solve a design problem, you know, and you ask 10 of your colleagues to sketch for a half hour, you're going to have 10 fresh ideas, and then you can parse those and, whittle them down to maybe a few key, core ideas. But it's a very efficient way to work for, an hour, and it's not something that we had really thought about. It is more of like an academic model, I think. And another thing that for me, and really didn't think about this during school, but since then, is I find that there's a real value in drawing together. And I mean that in two ways. So one is, a group of people with, paper and pen drawing independently and then sharing um, what they've come up with. But I think even more so, I've found that it's been incredibly productive for two or more people to sit in front of the screen or in front of a plan and draw together on one piece of paper, and throw ideas around, like, hey, what if we change that? What if we bounce, what if we move this over here and flip that around? And I guess it seems kind of counterintuitive, but it has been, I think, some of the best design work that I've been a part of has come out of those conversations where it's literally, two hands drawing on one piece of paper. And I think I would suggest that you try it. Like if you're stuck on a problem, like maybe bring your trace over to someone else and try to draw together. Um, it definitely has helped me. So these are some other images from some of these workshop days. We try to get out in the field. We do a lot of model making. We do plant ID walks with, everyone has to try to guess what the plants are and spelling counts. And then there's a prize at the end. So those are always fun. I mentioned model making, and I'm not sure if you're all making models in school. I know that we were required to, but that's actually carried over. And this is something that Stephen is incredibly passionate about, and he's an incredibly talented model maker, although many folks in our office are. And we've found that, building a physical model, this is one of sort of a finished project, but or a finished design, I should say. And if you take this to your client, this does all the work for you. Like, yes, you do need drawings to convey certain things, but if you have a model that's done in a way that a client can understand how things are going to look and the relationships, it does so much of the work for you. And so we have loads of models around the office of all scales. Some are study models, some are 3D printing, some are more like this. This is project at Industry City, that are more finished. Um, I think there's a real value in this. And whenever we're looking at portfolios, we're also looking at craft, right? Like, what can you bring? What can you bring to the office that's, new or interesting? And I think don't be afraid to show us that. It doesn't need to just be renderings and computer generated drawings and graphics. Um, and sort of a very different scale, another part of our process is um, taping out design. And what I mean by that is actually, okay, we have drawn something, we have an idea of what we want, and it's not been formalized, it's not approved necessarily, but we want to test it. So we'll go to the site with our tape and strings and, solo cups filled with rocks, whatever it takes, and try to accurately draw on the ground what we're proposing. And I can't tell you like how valuable this is because um, inevitably you change things. Inevitably you realize that that angle was just slightly off, or actually, you know what, that doesn't work at all. And I don't think there's any other way to do it other than getting out there and taping out. And I think that's something that anyone can do. Maybe not for every project, but there are ways to just study maybe one element of your design. If it's just a key piece, build a prototype, even if it's just cardboard or tape. Participatory design is incredibly important, especially when we're talking about housing, right? We're outsiders. We're going into someone's home, a place they might have lived their entire life with their family, and we're going to change it. And there's often distrust, or maybe it's not so much distrust as it's apprehension, and that people want to know what we're all about. And I always remind folks in the office that like the most important thing we can do during these meetings is listen, right? Like the knowledge that the people that live here can give us is so invaluable to our projects. And then after we have these conversations, we always try to get people to draw. So we hand out, pencils and paper, and we just try to get them to draw or even write out their vision. And we bring that back and we try to analyze it, and then we keep that. It's a guiding document, and it's something we refer back to. And it's also very valuable when the client says, you know what, maybe we shouldn't do that, and we remind them, hey, the residents want this, and this is their home, this is the place they're going to come back to every day after work. This is their front door. And usually that's a good piece of leverage we have. This one is probably a little bit unique to terrain. So um, we get very hands-on when it comes to planting design. And I think part of that is working and practicing in New York, many of our sites are small enough that we're able to do this, although we do try to do it on large projects as well. But what that means is we physically pick up every single plant, and if we can't lift it, then the contractors do it and place it where we want it. And it's a bit like painting, I think. You have a plan, you have an idea, you have a palette, but you don't know where it's all going to end up at the end of the day. And I'm sure if you had to do it twice, it would never look the same. And so these are some fun photos uh, of a lot of hard work, but also I think most people would agree this is some of the best days in the office is when we're out on site doing planting layout. We get to see it go in the ground. It's very fulfilling. Yeah, I'll conclude shortly here, and maybe there's some questions, or we can go back to anything I talked about. But we'll actually be leaving on Monday. We do an office-wide retreat, which I think is super important. I mean, it's important to spend time with your colleagues. I mean, we work so much of our lives, and outside of the office, outside of the work setting, I think it's an opportunity to talk about design, but to also get to know one another and get to explore a landscape we wouldn't normally see. This is it out by Montauk in Long Island, and this year we're going to go to the Adirondacks, which will be really nice. I think it's also an opportunity to recharge, because I always find when I come back from a vacation or a break that I do feel better mentally. I feel like I can take on more, but I'm just one person in the greater office. But when we all go, I think as an office, we come back a little bit, recharged. I think we're able to take on a little more. We're able to make maybe better decisions or be more efficient. It's not just one person, but it's everyone. And I think I'll conclude here. This was actually last night, and so that's Steven. He's the principal and founder, and um, we were celebrating. He was celebrating 20 years of since the founding of Terrain, and it was a really special moment. A lot of people came out, and we had a great time. And I was thinking about it this morning, and it dawned on me that there's a bit of a parallel between the event last night and our conversation today, and that a lot of former employees and staff members, they came and they met people that work at Terrain now, and they had never met before. Like maybe they had heard about them, but they had never met, and it was a real opportunity to just the old and the new to talk. But they share this common thread, and that's Terrain and Steven and the work we've done. And it got me thinking about our conversation today. Like obviously you don't know me, I don't know you, but we share something. We share our experience at Virginia Tech, we share landscape architecture. And so I want to let you know that feel free to reach out to me anytime. If you're in New York, let me know, and can try to meet up, or I can show you the office. But it is important for me that you all know that we're coming from the same school, and I think probably have other things in common, and that's really important. Yeah, I don't know, Sean, if there's questions, or do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, we'll open up to questions from you guys. Can you hear me right there, Brian?
Yeah,
Cool.
loud and clear.
Questions? Oh God, just right the back. I have to really shout.
So you said that with different stones and finishes and things like that, that it's kind of like piecing together almost like a puzzle, I guess. How do you go about knowing how to piece together that kind of puzzle with all the different stones and finishes, and even just how the light and the shadow can make everything look different? Is there a process, or is it more of just it just kind of happens?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's definitely a process. We have a lot of samples in our office, and we'll actually get them wet or put them in the direct sun, or just think about how they look vertically versus horizontally. And you can actually order, a lot of places will send you these samples for free if you just email them or fill something out online, and you'll end up with a big box of rocks somewhere. But it's definitely a process in that way. And then it's also just an experimentation. Like I was saying, each one of the dots on the map represents some learning, and it just takes time. So I guess it's a bit of both.
Who's next? We had a few hands up.
The apprehension that you feel like going into somebody's, their space, their community, like how do you deal with that from like a design perspective? Do you go into it thinking like we may have to change things, or like do you have an idea in mind to make it feel more like somebody's home? Like I feel like in any type of design that's like complicated of, especially in like a city that's already developed, of like working around people's existing like feelings about like their home and their space.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I try my best to leave my preconceptions at the door and just listen. And honestly, like we'll sit down and at a table, there'll typically be like one or two designers and 8 or 10 residents. And we'll just ask them to go around the room and I'll just be scribbling notes and trying to just extract information. But my job isn't necessarily to like present to them or even give them options like, hey, you could have that, you could have this. It's like it's about them just telling me what they want. And one thing we've found that's actually been really effective is if you can convince somebody to have a member, a resident that's at your table at the end actually stand up and kind of summarize the findings of the group. So it's not me as the designer doing that and sort of picking and choosing what I think is important. It's actually the resident that's kind of distilling the information. And we've found that to be a pretty powerful uh, way to, I think, distill out what's probably the most important.
How do you guys balance and prioritize like the types of projects that you're doing? Because a lot of them were about like affordable housing and stuff like that. And I would imagine that some other projects might be more lucrative than that, but it seems like this is also, I don't mean for it to sound rude at all because I love what you're doing and I hope I get to do things like that. But just how do you guys balance doing those projects?
Yeah, I think I understand the question. You know, it's tough. The often the affordable and supportive projects do have more limited resources. Not always, but often. And I think we do the same process for both pretty much to a T. Maybe where it varies and how I could answer your question is sort of the amount of time we do it for. So, we may have one design charrette and we crank out a bunch of schemes, for us. It's kind of standard affordable or supportive housing building. Whereas, if it's something, public or commercial, that may just happen more times. And so it's just about spending the correct amount of time designing to sort of fit the budget. Um, Also, I would say that a lot of, from like a kind of business side of things, like a lot of our clients are repeat. It's repeat work. And so, maybe the first couple go arounds, there's some apprehension and it takes a little bit more time to convince them. But hey, once they can see that it can be done and they can manage these buildings with a great landscape, then it's easy, right? And then it just gets easier. And that also makes us more efficient.
How much of the designs is like terrain's process versus what the client actually wants?
I mean, that's a good question. Well, I will say a couple things about that come to mind. So I'll pull up this map, like the ones in yellow, single family residential. I mean, that's someone's home, right? That's their yard. It's not shared with anyone else. And often those projects it's a really, you have to have a really strong relationship with the person living there because they could just change their mind. You're through design and, oh, actually we don't like that anymore. And then that can be really tough. But when it's sort of multifamily housing or a commercial job, you're working with somebody that it's also their day job, right? Like they want to make a decision, they want to like kind of guide it, but at the end of the day, they want to go home and not think about work. So I think that helps for sure. Some clients also just are more hands-on. Some people have really strong ideas about design, and some people don't at all. And I think it's a kind of about reading the room and like understanding like, okay, they don't seem to really have an opinion. That's fine. Like we will show them what we think works. And other times it's like they definitely have an opinion. We're going to need to be strategic about how we present our designs, especially if they're maybe not in alignment with their opinions, and that happens often.
There you go.
Do you find it harder if like a client is more overbearing or if they're just like way too general about what they want?
I find it easier if they're more general about what they want. I think, we get asked sometimes like, oh, it's interesting, like your projects don't really like you don't have like one design aesthetic, like they're kind of they vary greatly, and I think part of that is born out of clients that trust us and maybe don't have um, really strong preconceptions about what a landscape should be in an urban environment. And it's also, born out of like how we work as a team where sort of I think the most junior people do the most design. As you advance up, it's a little bit more about communication and organization and a little bit less about design and graphics. So I think, the most junior designers in the office tend to have the most design opportunity, which I think is maybe not what uh, people would assume, and definitely not how all firms operate.
Do you see the firm switching to more rural projects ever, or more just staying in a city?
Yeah, we do a little bit, but I mean, I think sort of Steven's ethos is about kind of bringing ecology into the city. I think where we thrive is sort of taking advantage of like every square inch of the site. Sometimes our sites are just little postage stamps, and so it's like every inch is so valuable. Um, we do some estate work. You know, we do schools, we do other types of projects, but I think we thrive in, tough sites, tough conditions. And, there's lots of other firms doing great work in sort of suburban areas. I wouldn't say that that's aren't necessarily like um, our specialty.
On the back.
Um, when like designing, are you guys considering like the long term kind of like how these projects like sustain? I feel like when designing something I worry about is like in 5 or 10 years, especially with like affordable housing, something in a city that's government owned, that it becomes, decrepit or doesn't look as like nice as you intend. Like how do you deal with like maintenance or making things that are gonna stay looking nice like over like 50 years?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real landscape architecture specific question, right? Because we always joke like, if an architect could come back to their building 100 years later and it looked the same, well, that's a great success, right? It didn't fall down, no one tore it down. But for us, we know like it's going to change instantly. As soon as plants go in the ground, as soon as material starts to weather, things are going to change. And so there's a few things we do. We don't lie to our clients like, hey, landscape requires maintenance. Do you have the stomach to take this on? And if the answer to that is no, then we have to be really strategic about what we propose, because we don't want to set them up for failure. Like you said, like we're talking about groups that maybe have limited resources. And I think sometimes we're more successful than others. Sometimes we go back to these sites and things are looking rough and it's clear they haven't been maintained or the irrigation hasn't been maintained and plants have died. And it's like we have to ask ourselves, like, what could have we done better? What can we do, next time? So it's a constant battle, I guess, and constantly learning. And I don't have a good answer to your question. It's very tough.
Time for maybe one or two more questions. Okay.
How do you handle like international design? Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so for a firm like us, we're small, so we would be pretty much any project that's outside of New York City will be brought on mostly just as the design team, and then there'll be a local landscape architect or architect who will handle like, dealing with all the local codes, being on the ground during construction, um, drawing the final sets of drawings and specifications for the project. So we're kind of giving a big vision, and then stepping back and just sort of peer reviewing the local team. That's how it works for us as a small firm. I don't think there's any other way for us to do it, but I know larger firms so sometimes actually send people to, the site for like extended periods of time. It just doesn't make sense when we only have like 10 or 12 people.
I'm gonna look over here for the last question from you guys. Too quiet. Or Coleman just beat.
You sure? Yeah, we mentioned how like terrain really tries to focus on like this ecology transformation. I was just wondering what kind of examples you guys start to see that like residential design.
Um, I think like, this isn't surprising. I don't think it should be surprising. Like, a focus on native plants, a focus on reduction of, maintenance. I mean, this is obviously like a single family home in Long Island. We worked with a wetland ecologist to clean up this entire setback this is a river. It was full of kind of old tires and debris, and that was all pulled out. It probably didn't have to be, but we insisted on it. And so this was sort of rewilded, mostly native plants. And then, just kind of carrying some of that through. I mean, the client still wanted a tennis court, which you can kind of see here, and some things that they could enjoy their property, but we did push for what we thought was important from an ecological standpoint. And you can see here, this is a kind of a woodland path through, a group of native plants, and all these things start to add up. We especially see that in the city.
Last, and I think we can slip your question in.
I was interested to see how tangible a lot of the work was produced from terrain. And you'd mentioned that your tangible portfolio was something you felt strongly about. I was just wondering, how does that impact the design process as far as maybe taking a step away from all the digital, and like what kind of impact does that make in the final design?
I mean, I can only speak for my experience, but for us, analog, model making, drawing, sort of this idea of craft it's incredibly important in the process. And when we meet as a group every other Wednesday for a few hours and we draw together, like no one brings their laptop, right? It's pencil and paper, it's markers, it's cutting out paper models and things. So for us, that's vital. That's how we work. And I'm sure that that's kind of what I was looking for, and probably why one of the reasons I've stayed here for 9+ years is because that's something I enjoy doing, and I always find it to be valuable. So I think like as you step out into the professional world, like I'm sure there'll be things that are important to you, and that's part of trying to find a good match when you're looking for a job. So for me, it worked out well.
All right, let's bring it to a close and give Brian a big old round of applause, a thank you for. All right, thank you very much, Brian. We'll call it a close and say hi to Stephen for me.
Sure, will do. And please let me know if you're ever in New York. Anyone, happy to meet up.
Catch you later.
Bye.